It's a pleasure to welcome you to the annual Elson Lecture. The Elson Lecture Series was endowed in 1992 by the Honorable and Mrs. Edward E. Elson, and the series has brought to the gallery since 1993 distinguished contemporary artists who are represented in the gallery's permanent collection. The gallery is the proud owner of a wonderful painting by Cecily Brown, Girl on a Swing, of 1994, purchased for the gallery by the Collectors Committee, and members of the Collectors Committee are here in the audience today, so we owe thanks to you as always. Girl on a Swing, a marvelous painting in its own right, has particular resonance and relevance for the gallery with our rich collection of 18th century French painting, and you'll hear more about the work this afternoon. Today, Cecily Brown will be in conversation with Harry Cooper, curator and head of the Department of Modern Art here at the gallery. Many of you have the brochure for the program with a short biography of the artist. In case you don't have one, I would like to say just a few words about her. Cecily Brown was born in London in 1969, attended the Slade School of Art in the early 1990s, just when such young British artists as Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin were dominating the scene with provocative work. While Brown shared interests with some of them, feminism, sexuality, and mass media, her commitment to the history and practice of painting was distinctive. She moved to New York City in 1994 and has lived there ever since. A couple of notes. You will not only be able to hear today's program live, it's being recorded and will be available on the gallery's website along with the earlier Elson lectures. And then finally, I will remind you that when it's time to leave, go back out into the world, turn your cell phones back on, which means they should be off now. Anyway, let me introduce Harry and Cecily Brown.
Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to be here with one of my favorite painters. Thank you, Cecily, for coming down from New York for this.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Okay. And that's not a controversial choice. I think many people agree with me. Cecily has had a wonderful career, is having a wonderful career, going full throttle in, what would we say, early mid-career, knock on wood.
Yes.
And endlessly productive, always shifting gears, changing focus, changing format, but with a wonderful touch and continuity that we all recognize and count on, I might say, too, eagerly waiting what will come next. Cecily has had many exhibitions, including one here at the Hirshhorn some years ago, the MFA Boston, just to mention some of the American museums, the Des Moines Art Center, of course, numerous shows in Europe as well. And in October, you have an exhibition at the Drawing Center opening in New York City. So
That's right.
We look forward to that. But today, you have prepared for us something wonderful, which I gather you have not done before in such full measure, and that is to look at your sources, your inspirations. Maybe sources is a little too narrow a word, but the paintings in the history of art that you have drawn on. So I'm going to sit back to some extent and look on with this really wonderful show that you've put together, little exhibition, Cecily Meets the Old Masters. So take it away.
Well, thank you. It's so great to be here, and thank you all for coming. Well, it seemed to make the most sense to begin with Girl on a Swing. I think this is going to be obvious, but my works were always going to be on the left. And it wasn't really till you'd invited me to come today and we'd started thinking about what to talk about that I really began thinking about how Girl on a Swing was in a way the painting of mine that steals the most directly from the past. I mean, one of the things we talked about when you first came to see the painting was, of course, that it had a relationship with the swing of Fragonard. But when I really started looking at Girl on a Swing and thinking about how I talk about it, it struck me that, in a way, almost more than any of my other paintings, it sort of sums up my whole approach to looking at art of the past and using it in this almost magpie-like fashion, sort of sampling from other places, taking things from specific other paintings where needed. I think, unlike a lot of my peers, even at art school, I was always really obsessed with art of the past, and was kind of, I never really understood why anyone wouldn't be. That I wanted to go to the National Gallery in London, where I was studying, as much as to the Tate, and just had always found, just felt a very close relationship to art of hundreds of years ago. I never had felt any distance from it, really.
Did people make fun of you? Was it hard to, did you have to sneak around?
They made fun of me for just painting. It was
Right, we have to remember what was going on in London in the early 90s, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's very tempting just to look around, isn't it, to see it big, but we do have the image here to look at.
Yeah.
So, no, I was mocked mainly just for being a painter.
I see. Yes. Can you talk a little about this particular juxtaposition before we go on? Because as you say, there's maybe not any direct relationship here, but I wonder what you do see as the connection of the subject to the Fragonard. And there are other Fragonards of this motif, but let's talk about ours.
Well, the subject is a huge part of it. I mean, as someone who's always wanted to make figurative paintings, but who struggles with what it means to be a figurative painter, one's always clutching at any kind of subject that seems like something you can use today. And the swing is something that, even though, I mean, it does still exist today. A lot of my earlier works were very concerned with the erotic, and had a sort of sexual content and sex and violence. And I mean, I think in a way my whole subject is bodies in motion. But it's always like, what are those bodies in motion actually doing to justify them being in a painting? So the swing that I'd actually looked at first was this swing of Goya. And my painting has a very strong relationship to that. But I think with your swing, I mean, the subject really is not just a girl on a swing, is it? It's an erotic subject. I mean, and one always has to remember how things would have been read at the time as compared to how we read them now, because of course it just looks very sweet to us. But it was pretty loaded as a subject.
Yes, all those petticoats flying up in the air.
But even, it was actually quite a licentious thing for a young lady to be doing. It wasn't really very proper to be a single lady alone on a swing. And that the movement of the swing sort of is supposed to evoke, it's an exciting
process.
proposition, yes. So in a way, a lot of things that interest me about art of the past is when the subject is clearly sort of something very provocative or loaded, or the artist is obviously dying to talk about the big, life and death and sex, but they actually really can't. So it's what's under the surface. So, there's so much metaphor that,
What about palette, though? That's one thing that struck me just looking at these two. That maybe not consciously you've you've adopted a bit of that.
I think the palette, but
color
also
scheme.
maybe especially the sense of movement. And one thing I noticed putting this presentation together was that one of the things that a lot of the paintings we're looking at today have in common is a sense of movement and a sense of there's no stillness anywhere, that the eye is constantly in motion, and they're almost always paintings that really are very, very active. There's a tension, but there's always a sense of activity, and sort of the eye. There's a restlessness about it. That even in this sweetest of scenes, I feel like there's this underlying anxiety.
And you put us very much in the middle. We're being swung at here.
Yes.
More than in some of the sources. But maybe I didn't want to hold you up because we've got a lot to look at here.
Yeah,
And the Goya,
well, I think
yes.
the reason I'd actually seen the Goyas, some of these Goyas at the Prado, I think just after I'd left art school, and they had a massive influence on me, because I think the thing that moved me and excited me the most about them was exactly that the ambiguity or the double-edged thing of having a very sweet, seemingly innocent scene, but that with this underlying feeling of anxiety or that nothing is quite right, nothing is quite... there's a sort of almost cynical feeling to the painting.
Yes.
And there are these other Goyas of the time that I'm sure you know of.
This is a subtle one where the darkness is only creeping in. Yes.
Even the pose of the girl is quite outrageous for the time, I think. That she's fully exposed, full frontal. There aren't many other positions that a young woman would have been in that would have let you really appraise her figure in the same way.
Yes.
And then the Goya, it's a very odd painting. The back of the child with its back to you. I really do want to look at it big because it's just such a pleasure to see it so big. But you just feel, I think one of the things that drew me to it's very layered. There's no specific meaning. You just feel like you could stare at it for hours and that there are contradictions going on. It's not a straightforward story at all.
There's a dark and a light that intention throughout. I think but you've done something. I feel in each case that you've done something so different, and that one might not even think of some of these sources unless one were inside of you.
No, sure, and the problem is, when we talk about sources, the way I would have been working at this time was to have many art books open on the floor beside the painting, but not really looking at not working directly from any one source. And I think this was around the time of Girl on a Swing. This was a time when I really started working like this a lot. So there was the Goya. Then, I knew I wanted to... I loved the diagonal of Goya's tree, sort of really, dividing the painting in two. But I think I wanted my trees to be more dramatic and have this sort of top and bottom of the painting. But I knew I wanted these skinny branches as well. So my thought was, well, who does the best trees? And so I went to Bruegel. And the trees, where's my little light thingy? Yeah, so these, I was obsessed with these. And, this is basically a direct copy. There are other Bruegels that I looked at the time as well. But then, you start with one thing, so you're thinking who does the best trees and leads you to Bruegel. But that blue-green of the sky, I think, completely influenced the color of this painting as well. So it ended up being this sort of mashup. I think before this painting, I was so nervous about any one influence showing too much in the work that I wouldn't want to copy directly because I think it would show too much. But then I started realizing taking things directly from different places, it's all about how they mash up together, and they don't end up being really derivative. I mean, although at one moment I was worried that today I'd feel like I'd been exposed as all I really do is copy.
That's
which
why
is,
everybody is here.
But these just taking something as you need it, and then just to go back, this little Giorgione. Again, there's this, loved this little shrub in the Giorgione, and I'd made many drawings of it, of just that shrub. I just kept going back to it as this kind of ideal shrub, and then it appears in the painting. See, you can just see these few little leaves, which are all that remain, but that's taken directly from there. And then the Rousseau, I actually just picked this Rousseau because I couldn't remember which Rousseau I'd been looking at. My book had fallen apart by the time I was trying to find the exact source, but it was like lush greenery, Rousseau, skinny trees, Bruegel, and so on, shrub, Giorgione. And then, I think in the process, you start with all these, you start basically with a motif or the germ of an idea, which might be a girl, and then, okay, put her on a swing, and then you don't really look at anything, and the painting takes on its own life. And then if you feel lost, then you can go back to these sources.
Well, when I saw this in your studio and fell in love with it, I didn't know there were any sources
right.
at all. And I think what really drew me to it was what ends up being very original about it, I think, which is that clash of limbs, totally improbable, unnatural, impossible invention of limbs coming together with a swing being suspended from two different trees, which is, kind of getting this great tension into it and pulling the whole thing apart, and what's going to happen to her. She seems to be holding the whole painting together in a way,
right.
And keeping all those things together, and that's I don't see that in Bruegel and Rousseau, and a little bit in the Goya though, a little bit in the Goya.
Yes. I think one of the things that came out of being mocked for being a painter was that I've long felt that you sort of have to only do something in a painting that you can't do in any other medium. So I've always wanted to embrace the impossible space of a painting and to make clear that it's this highly artificial space and that it is made up and it's a fiction and that it can be these layers of different fictions put together. Yes. And so, there's a great freedom in this feeling that anything can happen in this painting, and that if I want the tree to go across, then why can't it? And that you can really use devices as you need them, and if the sky changes from turquoise to delphinium blue in one moment, then because the painting demands it. There's a freedom of going back and forth between trying to, take something. I don't think I'm that interested in reality, but take something that is a nod to reality and then have it juxtaposed with something that's completely impossible. To change the scale within a painting. Someone pointed out to me the other day that this new painting was so hard to look at because the horizon just won't sit still. And I took that as a compliment. That I want them to be quite difficult. In the end, the thing I want most of all is for people to be able to look at my paintings for a long time. And so, there are always these multiple entry points. And I always there's a refusal to allow any one reading. Yes. Which I think when you do take this apart and say the bush came from here, the tree came from here, the way that they all feed in, but that you can't really peel them apart. And in a way, it's almost like
press that button on the blender.
Right, exactly.
Enough.
Yeah, and sometimes it doesn't work and it goes wrong and things are too much themselves. But, I really want things to have this sensation, to not have a fixed meaning, and to convey that idea of how nothing is really fixed and nothing is really known and nothing is really nameable. And just when you think you're about to say, oh, it's a girl on a swing, then, something happens to throw you off that. And that's why I think the Goya, in a way, is the closest in mood to, what I'd like.
Of course, you've got me thinking about de Kooning now, and the slipping glimpse that he talked about, and of course the brushwork that must inform you. But I'm getting officially worried that we're not going to get
Okay.
past the girl
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
swing.
yeah.
So,
I know. We were worried about that. But there's just so much. I mean, I must say, it almost becomes like an allegory of painting itself, which is another reason I was so glad to start with it, because just for a minute to stay.
as long as you want.
I'm often asked about the whole battle of figuration and abstraction. And, my whole thing is it's not a battle. I mean, that the battle won't be won, that they're intrinsically bound, and that, I want to be on that tightrope where you kind of have it both ways. And I do think if this painting works, that it does do some of the things, the figure's there, but you can go dreaming off into these kind of spaces where, just when you think you've got it all sorted out where something is, that, it's almost like having the tablecloth pulled from under you. That's what I'd like to do visually. Giorgione Bruegel.
Okay.
So then we go to Paradise. And I threw this in here. This is actually almost a copy. And SAP is a very unimaginative title that is Study After Paradise. I've never liked that title. But there it is. But
it's abbreviated.
Yeah.
So we have no idea.
No, you do now.
We didn't.
I perhaps should have called it Sappy. But so this is interesting in that at the time it was one painting. I think I did one or two around the time and then moved swiftly on. But then recently we go now to last year and these are brand new paintings and it's all about paradise again. So I think one of the nice things about getting older as an artist is that this sort of, you realize that it's not just this linear progression and that one thing leads to the next and the next, but you start doubling back and going back to earlier things. And I'm almost now finding my own work as much of a source material as I've always found other people's.
Can you tell us, is this a Cole Porter lyric, or what about the title? for that?
Gosh, do you know, I know the song, I'm not going to sing it. I don't even know who.
Okay, does anybody know?
I think it's a 50s or 60s pop song.
All right.
I'd sing it if it was just us, but maybe later. So these are brand new paintings. And this, why don't I just flick through the next few, because these are all hot off the press. I thought it would be nice to jump to something very recent. And these are not directly, it's in a fairly indirect way that they use the images next to them.
Yeah.
I make drawings a lot, but I don't really use the drawings when I paint. But in this case, I'd been really trying to figure out a way to get animals into paintings. And I'd been making drawings and watercolors after this little Jacob Hofnagel. I mean, it's hard to say sometimes what draws you to a particular painting without sounding banal. I mean, it's so beautiful. Obviously the subject is very moving and very sweet and very, one sort of longs for the world to be like this. But it's not. I mean, there's something, I guess I'm interested in paradise because it's this completely unobtainable, more than ever. My versions of paradise are, everything's in peril, everything's disintegrating, nothing lasts. They're quite sad paintings, I think. But it struck me when I started doing copies of Hofnagel and these other Netherlandish or Flemish artists, something extraordinary, which is that we, in the 21st century, actually recognize all these animals and know all these animals, but at the rate the world's going, that even in 50 years, there might be people who have never seen some of these animals in the flesh. So there's this very poignant side to the subject, as we're suffering what we've done to the world.
Now, one thing that's happened, obviously, in the paintings, just from Girl on a Swing to recent work, is there's no longer that clear horizon,
Right.
the sense of landscape space. Things are even more complicated.
Yeah.
And is that something that has changed as you've been looking at paintings? How do you think about that? Just to get a bit of a broad look at your career.
I mean, the first thing that came into my mind was tapestries, and the way that, you know, the sort of flattened out space of a tapestry, and
Filled
that
up
I've maybe
with-
become, and that it's much more flat, and, you know, it has this border, and it's in a way even more fake than a painting. And maybe having looked at tapestries a lot has influenced these last paintings. But I think perhaps I'm even just less sure of things than I was 10 years ago, and that this reflects, I don't know, I mean...
Well, I think it becomes more involving in our need to distinguish things. It's not as easy. You're making it harder for us, and maybe in that way you're keeping us with the painting for a longer period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the more unfamiliar the space when you first look at it, then perhaps the more mysterious it is, and the more people might want to enter into it and try and figure it out for themselves. So if there's a less clear horizon, for example, I mean, the horizon's an interesting place to keep stopping, because, I mean, whether there is one or not, you could sort of do a whole history of painting of the horizon coming and going.
I was just thinking
Let me see,
about
is there a
that.
horizon in any of these? No, not really. But I think, you know, everyone knows the blue and green. You put blue and green in the distance, right? That makes your eye go a long way away. So
Yes.
there's this sort of way where that whole pulling the tablecloth under, that sense of not knowing quite where you are in relation to things. I think somehow when there's a horizon and an easily legible space, people tend to think they got it too quickly. And I found out very early on that if the image is too clear, people just think they get it so fast that, in a way, I think my sort of roundabout way of telling what's in the painting is to kind of lure them in and disallow that quick reading. You know, the downside is people might not bother to want to enter in the first place, so you've kind of got to get something that grabs them and makes them want to look, and then wants to keep them, you know, getting lost in it.
And we're focused, I think, much more in these works on the surface, on the stroke. We're detained there as we try to get our bearings, and some people will not want to face that challenge, I think, and then other people will. I will be glad, you know, just to see that that quotient of gesture and abstraction maybe rising in relation to the figure.
I mean, people often ask, I think people often think that there's a figurative painting that then gets hidden by abstract paint, so-called, which is not what happens at all. Most of my paintings, what you see when they're done, to use a word I'm uncomfortable with, what you see when I stop working on them is really the remains of my attempt to keep the figure in the painting. If there's no figure there, it's not for want of trying. You know, there's almost always, I'm trying to paint a figure or something from the figurative world and keep it in the picture. And sometimes I often start with more of a figure than there is at the end, but it tends to want to leave. And it's what you see is the result of kind of trying to drag it back into the painting. And so I think with these animal, you know, maybe it would be too obvious for some, but to have this beast at the bottom right, it's almost like you use something more figurative to anchor the painting, or to there are these moments of something recognizable, which hopefully sort of bring it back into focus, as it were. I've said this before, but my battle, or the sort of conflict, when a painting really gets too abstract and there's nothing recognizable left in it, I tend to lose interest in it. So it's really always trying to hold on to, trying to figure out how little, what fragment of information do you need to give in order to still have a sense of a physical presence there. Because I always want a presence of a human or animal in this case, but of something, and I prefer using the word figural to figurative, but the sense of something solid from our world. Otherwise, for me, it either goes into decoration, or I just don't know. Even I need, when I'm painting, to have something very specific in mind. And over the years, I think I've managed to let go of worrying as much whether the viewer is going to see it as I meant it, and to realize maybe that's not that important. But I find if I'm painting without, if I'm thinking of a horse's haunches, or how does a hoof go, and what's a turkey's tail look like, then the marks just have more authority and the gesture has more weight than if it's just a black line. And then it might easily just read as a black line where I thought it was thinking of a turkey, but it's about, intention.
Well, there's certainly the idea that abstraction gets found in the process of depiction, and I think for a lot of artists ends up being more powerful when something unconscious starts to happen in that process, perhaps. But I think it's interesting that you are holding on to the figure, but it's the figure in art history and the past. And I wonder if you feel a responsibility to some of these paintings and painters. I guess I'm asking why, that maybe the big question, why these sources, and why not something set up in your studio, or something from your imagination? But that's, I think, the big question in the air, and maybe it's too big of a question.
Well, it's a combination of a source and your imagination, and then the painting, as I've said, it can often just be the germ of an idea comes from the source, the outside source, and then the painting just becomes its own thing. I mean, with these Paradise things, I've done all these watercolors and drawings looking at a source. But with the paintings, I barely looked at anything. I think I used drawing as a way of internalizing the subject and even the forms. And I find just looking at something isn't enough. If I draw it, then I really understand it much better. But when I paint, with these, I didn't look at the source really at all. I mean, I might go back over to the drawing table and draw for half an hour. But, I think I use drawing as a way to, you get a kind of muscle memory. Like I'll use which we're going to talk about in a minute actually, but by drawing something again and again, it's like your body remembers it, so that when you come to paint and it's a larger scale, and I like painting quite fast, so I don't want to be pausing and fiddling around, so that it's just already in your body to remember how things go. And but that's interesting, the past being the thing that sort of anchors the painting. We talked a tiny bit before we came in about how I didn't bring anything contemporary today, or even very recent. The most recent thing is, I think, Max Beckmann. But then I realized I've never looked at a contemporary painting when I paint. I mean, I look at contemporary art a lot, but it's not really helpful to me for my day-to-day practice. It's all in, I could almost just look at this painting for the rest of my life and not ever look at anything else.
Well, you have such a deep connection that we haven't talked about to the history of art, to museums, and important early experiences with your father, David Sylvester, the amazing art critic. I know he took you through the Francis Bacon show at Tate
Right, when
many
I was
years
about
ago.
16.
Yes.
That was the first exhibition I saw that made me really love painting, I think. So before that, I didn't really look at much art growing up. I mean, just like any kid, you go to museums here and there, but at about 16, I started looking at art a lot. And the Bacon was the one that I really remember as having a huge impact. And as we said just before as well, a lot of this art of the past, I think, I look at through the eyes of more recent artists. Like, I was fascinated with the fact that Francis Bacon looked at Rembrandt and Degas and Picasso, and I've told you, Picasso, I got into Delacroix, who might be my favorite artist of all, through Picasso. So there's this almost, there's this remove. Like, I've never copied a Picasso, and it wouldn't occur to me to do so because it's too
close.
Too close. But to look at Delacroix through the eyes of Picasso or Ingres or any of these people, I'm always grateful for the modern artists who copied and made sense of. I mean, I think each generation makes sense of the one before, and copying is sort of unfashionable now, but everyone always used to do it, and I just think it really is the best way to understand something. And people, I think, often forget that painting is a physical thing, and you need to physically go through the motions to do it and understand it. But just to talk about internalizing something, this painting, I had a jigsaw puzzle of this painting. And I have done this jigsaw puzzle about 10 times. And I just feel like it's taught me so much more about art than almost anything else. And I really feel like I really understand this painting on a deeper level because of having done this puzzle.
Do you have a lot of jigsaw puzzles?
Yeah,
of paintings?
I do.
I feel as if you've given us some kind of a key to.
Well, you
to
feel
what
like you're
happens.
holding the key. I mean, with the Bosch, this is just the central panel, as I'm sure everyone knows. But you get to know it. It's this great thrill because the painting's so extraordinarily beautiful. You're holding this tiny little square inch of a painting, and that once you really get to know it, you can see at a glance whether it belongs in the foreground, middle ground, background, just at a glance, and it feels incredibly satisfying to feel that you're so familiar with every inch of the painting.
How long does it take you to do that puzzle now?
Well, I haven't done it for a couple of years now. I'm sort of wanting to do it again. But the funny thing is, I'd done the puzzle, and I'd never really done a painting or drawing from it until recently. And these are new, these drawings, which are directly from the Bosch. But as you see, I mean, the imagery comes from the Bosch, but it does become its own thing.
Very much. Jinx.
But yeah, I don't know about the growing up looking at art, how much. The first painting I remember really responding to was a Caravaggio Medusa that I saw when I was about 9. And I think that's significant because I think I thought of art as something, and then seeing Bacon, I think I thought of art as something quite grown up and frightening. But I still like that idea, that, it's quite an adult thing. I mean, I have a young daughter now, and we really don't drag her to see that much art, partly because we don't want to put her off. But or if we do go, sort of let her decide what to look at. So I just think a lot of it really is. I'm digressing,
No, finish that
I'm just
sentence.
thinking that when I was little, I think I quite liked the idea that art wasn't necessarily quite for me, that it was this sort of dangerous. There's something dangerous and sexy about it that wasn't necessarily for a little kid. I think it's because we had books on, Bacon and then George Grosz. And I think I used to sneak looks at it, thinking like I wasn't really supposed to be looking at this. And the Bacon in particular was quite scary.
So your idea of human anatomy was formed by...
Well, my favorite other painting, we had this reproduction of a gouache that was a George Grosz gouache of a butcher's shop, but it was all human flesh hanging up. and we were a family of vegetarians, so this image was really something to me. But that really had a big influence. But I just mentioned that because I think like the human meat and these quite heavy ideas were really there early on.
Here's some meat.
Yeah.
Laid out on the table.
And the only British artist here today. I just threw this in because I think Hogarth, copying from Hogarth was this really huge thing for me that I think made me realize how helpful it really was. And this is 2003. I'd had a studio visit from somebody who I respected a lot, and they had pointed out to me that my corners were always the weakest part of my paintings, and said, if you look at an old master painting, you'll see that there's almost always something really, it's all about the corners, and each corner will be totally different from the other one, and each corner will not prepare you for what happens in the next corner, but they might disappear completely. But if you really look at them, you'll see this is where all the tension lies. And I've always wanted to, again, that thing, if it's going to be on a rectangle, it better be a good rectangle.
Good corners,
it better be,
so
it's all about getting that tension. Yeah. And then I'd always also noticed that the bottom sort of eighth of my painting was often the weakest. Especially with big paintings, it's partly practical because it's harder to reach. You see all the work gets done in the middle of the canvas. But this Hogarth struck me because of this corset. I felt like Hogarth, almost more than anyone, was so brilliant at placing something that was a formal device that you didn't necessarily even notice it that well. But once you start looking at him and dissecting it, they're so brilliantly put together. Every moment is really active, and every moment also has such meaning. Again, he's someone that you could just read layers and layers of meaning into. But anyway, I copied this drawing in particular dozens of times.
Well, I'm impressed. I think I probably speak for everybody with the wonderful sensitivity of your drawing, and you're subjecting yourself to this and really entering into it, and that kind of work is then obliterated to a large extent in the paintings, but is somehow feeding the paintings in a way.
Yeah, and it was a kind of test. So I chose this one to show because I'd often start with the corset, but here you just see it indicated very loosely. But the idea was I always started with that woman and her hand with the fan, and then I had to work my way around the table, and it's almost, I wasn't allowed to, I had to go that way around the table and then get back round, and if his foot was in the right place in relation to her hand, I knew I'd been looking closely and that I'd pulled it off. But there would be dozens of times where it was miles away. But it was like really this exercise of making myself look really, really closely at something. And you really need to exercise your eye like that. And it would be so frustrating that you'd get around and his, foot would be here instead of here. And you felt like you'd got everything right. Everything else seemed to be in the right place.
And you can't start over with the pen and ink.
No, I'd make these rules so you weren't allowed back into it. And then recently I'd gone back to Hogarth, who I've loved all along, and this is a new drawing. But we haven't been talking about subject much, and Hogarth is, teeming with subject matter.
Your subject matter.
Yeah. And this image in particular, I want to flick forward a little bit just so we see what else we're looking at. So, Bruegel. It was so interesting putting this together because I've always vaguely known the people that I've worked from, but I've never sort of formalized it like this. And so to see this, wait a minute.
Jumping ahead. It was interesting because I started wondering, what do all these things have in common? Like, why is one drawn to this rather than something else? Oops. Well, you spoke about bodies in motion as a through line.
But also human folly. I was thinking of Hogarth in relation to Bruegel, and then the Michelangelo that's just coming up, the Temptations, or the Torment. That so much of it really is about you know,
What people do to each other?
yes,
Mm-hmm.
the silliness of humans and the absurdity of everything.
The Michelangelo, that's a very early, is that his
I
first
think it's
painting,
the first
I think?
known one. He was about
Yes.
12 or
Yeah,
13.
Incredible painting.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
enough to make you give up. But, and that's a copy, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a copy of from don't know. I'm pronouncing it right, but Schongauer.
Schongauer. Maybe this is too even obvious to say, but also multiple figures.
Yes.
There, even in Girl in a Swing,
Mm-hmm.
there are figures lurking
Yeah.
everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You don't seem happy with a single figure or a couple of figures.
Oh,
and
no.
there's got to be a teaming
Yes.
activity.
I think teaming activity is the key
Yeah.
phrase. All the paintings that I'm really drawn to or that I respond to the most have this teaming activity and this sense of motion and life. And I haven't actually got really any heavens and hells here, but I mean I've always been very, very drawn to heaven and hell.
Yes, but I noticed with the Bosch, you went for paradise.
Yeah, but that paradise is very,
Yeah,
it's very
it's,
debatable whether it's almost
right.
the in-between. So that is the most interesting of all. Because when I look at other people's heaven and hell, I mean, I'm always drawn to hell. I think like probably most people, because I mean, there's a sort of salacious appeal and the horror of it. And the devil has all the best tunes. And
Right.
so it is kind of more interesting, usually visually, to look at. But
you've got some happy animals who are cavorting and.
yeah, but I've always, I mean, I think
But the people are not so happy.
well, my idea has always been. Has my mic gone weird because it fell out, or is it fine?
They're good, I think.
To have heaven and hell in one place, and that's really where we are, and that I wouldn't want to separate the two, which is probably why I focus on the central panel of Bosch, but that, you know, they are intrinsically bound, or, you know, good and evil. It's all about having both in one place, and that there might be I mean, the battle between Carnival and Lent. Well, it says the fight here. I think sometimes it's called the battle. What can you say? I mean, it's.
Yeah.
I mean, what are you doing in a painting? But I mean, you've only got one place to say it all, right? So it's kind of trying to say everything at once. And a painting, I think, is uniquely disposed to do that. You can really.
It doesn't move.
No.
It sits
And
there.
it can be, you know, you don't really read it from left to right, you know, especially with a format like this. But, you know, going back to that idea that there has to be a reason for it to be a painting rather than something else. That one of the things that keeps drawing me to painting over all this time is that, you know, the ability it has to be outside of time. You can spend as long with it as you want, or a few seconds if you, but that it's constantly unfolding before your eyes, and that, I mean, I've realized all the paintings that I'm the most drawn to are never ever saying any one thing. I've never, Vermeer, for example, I don't really get Vermeer because that's too much. It's just too singular, too clear. And I mean, obviously there are moments in Vermeer where, you know, they're amazing.
It's so refreshing to hear somebody say they don't really like Vermeer. I haven't heard that
I
in
sort
a
of
long
wondered if there'd be a
time.
gasp. It's just a test, really.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see what, you know.
It's not your thing.
No.
That's for sure.
But even, you know, I'm jealous of someone like John Currin for his ability to say one thing and just say it so completely and so finally and down to the fingernails. And I just can't do it, however hard I try. And then I think psychologically I just can't do it because of my, it's not, I don't think it's indecision. On a bad day, it might be indecision, but it's just this inability to really say, yes, that is the way things are,
Well,
once and for all. Whenever I try and do a single figure, I did it a little bit. I'm always still trying, but I'm pretty much incapable of just saying one thing, one way. Maybe this would be a good moment to move on to the women.
Tell us about this. I think some people will recognize this who had the record album. And,
Yeah. So it's a Jimi Hendrix album cover from Electric Ladyland, and it was an image I always loved as a teenager. And this is one of the only instances where there's a photographic source. And it actually came about in a weird way, where I was asked to do something specific for a friend, for a benefit. They were asking artists to make a work based on an album cover. And I usually run a mile from that kind of thing. But because I'd always loved this image, I thought I can actually do something with this. It always reminded me a lot of the Ang bathhouse. And obviously there are lots of lots of paintings that you can relate to it. So I made this big collage using photographs and things, and then I thought that was it. But when I got back in the studio, I couldn't get the image out of my head, and I kept drawing it, and then finally it was obvious that I wanted to paint it. But actually drawing it was very much like copying the Hogarth. It was very much about, how do I fit this on the paper? It sounds it's one of the dumb propositions that any painter will understand, of just like, how do you get from one side of the canvas to the other? It's like a big question.
You don't do that squaring off thing, do you?
No. So it almost became this formal proposition of how to get it down. And I knew I wanted to make this image, but I was very conflicted about it at the same time. I was conflicted about painting naked women. I'd sort of avoided painting a female nude for most of my life.
You painted male nudes early on.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd painted nudes doing things, but I'd never just painted a straightforward nude. And then here were 15 nudes all at once. So I felt sort of quite, I was doubtful whether this was a good idea in the first place. But I think what worked about these is that you can really see that conflict, and that one of the things that gives the paintings their sort of angsty presence is the fact that I was so unsure whether or not this was a good idea.
Why were you worried about it?
I wasn't sure if it was a positive image of women, and so I didn't know if I really wanted to be putting this into the world. I felt that it was very ambiguous where I stood in relation to the women. I wasn't sure who they were or what I was saying about them.
Could it possibly be a male Orientalist fantasy?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I was just very uncomfortable with putting more female nudes into the world. It's not something I'd ever wanted to do. But I think I got around it. First of all, there's very little... I don't think they ended up being tittillating at all.
I love the way the black works in through the image and almost becomes an image in itself. Tracing all those linkages.
I mean, the one on the left here, I included that because I felt like, so I'd started these paintings and I got very stuck with them because they were too photographic. But I found it so exciting to try and do something so specific after the normal way I work, being quite, loose, and they're sometimes frustratingly vague, even to me, of knowing where they're going, because I'd never have a clear idea of how I want it to look. But this was something so specific, it was very exciting for me. And the other thing that was exciting was to be trying to depict a face, which was always something I'd avoided, because it's the hardest thing of all. But because there was a whole sea of faces, it really got around the question of how to paint a face, because you could really approach the face in 10 different ways. So it was very liberating to paint faces and to do some, one that's sort of almost photographic, and then you could have the one next to it almost like a mask, and just these very different treatments of the faces. But for a while, I was very stuck with them, and I put them on the back burner. And then this one was the first where I felt like I figured out how to move forward, was just this whole section where I felt like it became a painting instead of just a copy of a photograph. And then I went back into the others, and I mean, that maybe sounds too romantic or something, but it needed to go away from the source. So I stopped looking at the photograph, and only started looking at the paintings. And by the last one, I did about 7 of them. I could paint them by heart without, I'd know exactly where each woman went. And I mean, you'd hope so, but after drawing them so many times. But I loved doing these paintings so much, I basically could have painted them for the rest of my life. But I knew I had to move on.
So you got over all of your worry about that. And,
I didn't really get over it.
Yeah.
I just felt like the paintings did embody the worry, so that I didn't think they ended up being, just
complicit in.
Yeah, and they were. I mean, the women, I suppose, were groupies, supposed to be groupies in the original photograph. Hendrix hated the cover, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, but I felt like, you can't really fight. You shouldn't fight when you have such a strong instinct to do something. But what I did fight was my desire to just go on painting them forever and ever. And I realized that I really wanted to do a male nude, which will come in a minute.
So we have a few more minutes, but I know people are looking at these, and you probably don't even need to tell us what's going on here. But this is, it's such a wonderful studio where everything is on wheels and moving around, and there's the mirror to get a fresh look, I guess, at the paintings reversed. I think I see Angra's Turkish bath there, maybe on the lower
so you
left,
do. Very good.
on the easel.
Oops, I meant to go.
Gotta
Where's
be.
it gone? There we go.
And,
That's right.
So just a wonderful.
Yeah, and it seemed worth throwing in a few studio shots to discuss
Yes.
process. But this one I love because, see, right after doing the women, I just felt this very heavy conscience that I have to do men. I can't have put all these images of women into the world. But I was really stuck with how to move forward and paint men. And this moment has the last of the women paintings at the end, and then the beginning of these big male nudes. And on the easel, on the thing, I was happy to see there's this one photograph. I really wanted to do men, and I didn't know how, but
Is that where we get into the young Spartans, or does that come?
Let's just flip through.
Yes.
It was actually Beckman.
Very strange.
And there's
early
both a very early
painting.
Beckman and a late. But I didn't want to do bathers because they didn't make any sense. Back to what is someone doing in a painting? Like, there are no bathers anymore. So I'd avoided looking at bathers when I was doing the women. And everyone also said Demoiselle d'Avignon, which I also avoided looking at because I just wanted it to be its own thing and not be overly influenced. But then I can't remember which came first, but I think I started, it was on the table, wasn't it? These young Spartans of Degas,
painting. Yeah.
which was always one of my favorite paintings. I think in the middle of trying to figure out how to paint boys or men, I was in London and visited this, which has always been one of my favorite Degas, or paintings in the world. And this group of boys is just so extraordinary. And the moment, and it seemed to make perfect sense because it is really the battle of the sexes, and the girls are sort of winning, I think. I love the boys. They have that perfect adolescent, they're sort of arrogant, but they're terrified. And it's just got so many, there's such a range of emotion on these kids' faces. And so this group of boys became the way into painting the male figure. And this one actually has, so you see this guy here is, I'll show you next. This is obviously, here they are,
Yeah, but where
the
does
little
that
cluster.
crouching guy come from?
They're coming from here, and then, but he
That
comes
guy,
from this, there he is.
okay.
That's him.
Okay.
So that's why I think that studio picture, you said it would be nice to have studio pictures, but I didn't realize I'd have one that really had it all in at the same time. So you really see the back and forth.
I don't know how you can stand that early Beckmann painting personally.
Oh, yeah.
But you made good use of it.
Yeah.
This is such a extraordinary painting to work from.
This came after the women because I was like, all right, enough already. But I still wanted, it's like, another thing of what's the subject? And this seemed a very, very loaded and exciting subject that could still somehow be relevant. And from combing my own daughter's hair, I know that it's it's actually quite an extraordinary thing to do, because the child will struggle and scream even though you're barely touching. But I feel like this painting has an underlying sadism. And
Do you want to lead us through a little bit with your pointer and show us the comb and the hair? And
in mine?
Yes.
Well, here's the leg and the knee and the feet, and the hair is here, really. I mean, it's not actually just from this painting. I was looking at lots of combing the hair, but here she is.
And there's
But again, this is more working from memory. I know this painting very, very well, so this is more just having it in my head. But Degas, I think, is the king of that underlying tension and darkness, and something that's seemingly fairly innocuous, having sort of rather terrifying undertones.
And the use of the black,
Yeah.
that I'm sure appealed to you as well.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to finish your tour quickly, and then we'll.
Well,
open it up.
this is brand new, and it's always really hard to talk about the newest thing. So this figure is one of my favorite figures in all painting. I just don't know what it is about this shirt over the head, but if you start looking at my paintings really closely, you'll see him basically making cameos for the last 20 years. Just something about that motion. I did these early drawings as well after Goya of someone sort of having his shirt pulled off. So they kind of meld. That's what I should emphasize. It's not always just taking and using as is. Mm-hmm. And the whole joy of having all these paintings in your head is the way that they don't just commingle on the canvas. They're commingled in your head, So the Piero guy with the shirt is mixed up with this Goya guy with his shirt being pulled off, and then that gets mixed up again with something else. So I know Bacon described it as having this, he said he had this slideshow in his head where paintings would just keep dropping in like slides, and I love that. I know the feeling. But I really love this. When I'm painting, I feel like you kind of use your visual memory as this kind of slideshow, and things will come up as needed. And it might be something you haven't thought about for a long time. Like I hadn't used him for a while. And then...
You could say a lot more, but I don't know if you could say it any better than that, and I don't want to really say anything after that either. And
Okay.
I wonder if that might be a good place to pause and see if there are any questions.
Great.
But I want to thank you for speaking so well about your work.
Thank you.